People often obsess over weaving tales about Da Vinci codes or alien remains in the Vatican archives. But in reality, the most terrifying thing there isn't a doomsday conspiracy, but merely a scrap of a sticky note that reads simply, "Not yet for history." You think secret means a dark mystery? Oh no, in Latin, secretum simply means private, much like a personal drawer for the various popes. But look at what this drawer contains: an invisible library of those who happen to be smarter than their era. The modern church no longer has the habit of incinerating theories with fire. They choose a way that is much more polite and far more ruthless: delay. Why play the villain when you can just slap an untimely label on a great discovery and then cast it into the shadows for 300 years? That is not preservation. That is cowardice, wrapped in the velvet layers of caution. Priests and scientists who dedicated their entire lives only to be ghosted by the very organization they served, simply because their truth made the superiors feel uneasy. History here is not written in blood, but in parentheses and missed appointments with the truth. A mercy that reeks of mold, wouldn't you say? I am Zorro. Dim the lights, pour yourself something bitter enough, and walk with me through the door where history is still being forced to pause right now. In Rome, people usually hold their heads high to admire proud monuments or saints carved from pure white marble. But if you are observant enough, or cynical enough, like me, you will learn how to look into the shadows. There is a door here, my friends. It's not on any Google Maps tourist route. It doesn't carry the pride of a famous sculptor, nor are there any angels guarding it with flaming swords. If you happen to walk past, you'd think it was the entrance to a broom closet or a narrow hallway for men carrying buckets of water. Men who have learned how to walk on stone floors without leaving a single footprint. That is the most perfect trap. In this city, the most sacred rooms aren't always gilded. Truth is often disguised in the garb of mundane service corridors. I didn't come here as a scholar with a chest full of shiny Latin degrees. My badge reads custodial, maintenance staff. A word that sounds lowly, but it means the holder of keys, the watcher of silence. I've learned where the light switches hide. I know which hinges will groan when touched. And I can feel which stones still hold the winter chill from 3 centuries ago. In these corridors, you must lower your voice even when you are alone. Why? Because the silence here is not the absence of sound. It is a resident. It has a physical presence. It demands you be polite, or it will stifle you. After just a week, I could find that door, even if blindfolded. Not by signs, but by the way the air changes. It's drier, older, as if time here has its own distinct climate, unrelated to the noisy world outside. People often mention the Vatican's secret archives with a curious smile, the way people talk about storms on distant hills. They utter the word secretum and dream of underground vaults making hissing sounds, flashing red lights, or sliding shelves hiding horrific secrets about aliens or the descendants of Christ. Oh, the romance of the ignorant is truly lovely. Here is your first lesson. Secretum does not mean scandal. According to ancient Latin, it means private, the personal property of the Pope. But language is a funny thing. And privacy, when it sleeps too long in a glass palace, begins to grow horns. What started as a personal filing cabinet has been mistaken through generations as a locked box containing the church's shame. That confusion is actually quite attractive, isn't it? It explains every conspiracy theory in the world, but the truth is much older and quieter. This archive is not where the church hides what it cannot defend. It is where they keep what they cannot yet endure to say. Step through with me. There is no ritual, no eerie whistling wind, only the gentle yielding of old hinges. There are no stained glass windows here, no brilliant light to teach children to love heaven. There are only simple walls and plain floors. The bookshelves rise like forests of discipline, upright, patient, repetitive to the point of vertigo. The labels here aren't dramatic. You won't find drawers stamped top secret in gold. Instead, you will see dates, handwriting, and the precise nuances of restraint. Here, paper has its own creak, and ink has its own stillness. Every time a scholar turns a page, I feel as though a century has just shifted, and the shape of the air changes again. In these halls, time does not rush. It rearranges itself. You can find a decree that changed the fate of a nation lying right next to the plea of a poor mother, asking for a priest to come bless the bed of her dying child. The archive accepts all without class distinction, because here, memory is not data. Memory is an act of compassion. But be careful how heavy compassion can be when it is encased in layers of parchment. There is a type of weight that doesn't bruise you immediately. It just lowers your shoulders imperceptibly over the years. I have pushed carts loaded with those boxes for scholars, people who have learned how to smile without using their mouths. On slow afternoons when their footsteps have vanished, I often stop and feel the boundary between my breath and the breath of the past. And then, in my 3rd month working here, the first whisper appeared. A drawer opened by only a finger's width, perhaps a deliberate accident by some scholar. It revealed a file with no code, no papal seal. Only a small note clipped to the cover, simple as a winter window frame. Hoc nondum historiae est. This is not yet for history. I did nothing dramatic. I didn't hold my breath like a thief in a Hollywood movie. I just slid the drawer shut with a reverence that made me shiver and walked on. But that sentence followed me home. It sat with me at the dinner table. It posed a question that makes any place holding records tremble. When is a truth old enough to become harmless? And more importantly, who has the right to decide that? If you think having an access badge to this place means you can read everything, you are dead wrong. There are rooms here that rarely anyone enters, even among the most powerful scholars, because to read what is inside, credentials or degrees are not enough. It requires you to have a skin-crawling hunger for the ambiguous. Look, this is a room holding records that aren't exactly denials, but aren't confessions either. They are the pauses of history. You can recognize them through the scribbles in the margins, the marginalia, with words like delay, reserve, needs reconsideration. And a bit further is a room not arranged by subject or language. It is arranged by temperature and darkness. That is where the most fragile things rest. Items that cannot endure even your pure, curious gaze. There are wax stains there that still hold the fingerprints of a trembling cardinal. There are types of ink that will immediately turn into ghosts, evaporating from the page if you accidentally breathe too hard on them. And there are jars of ashes. Yes, ashes. They are only labeled with a single year, brief and cold, echoing in your head like a judge's gavel striking the sentencing table. I once stood in a dark corner, watching a conservationist lift a piece of paper from a wooden box marked 1633. He placed it on a felt cloth carefully and with trembling hands, as if he were returning a bone to a body that had just been exhumed. We said nothing to each other. In that moment, any sound from the throat would have been an indecency. If you want a definition of an archive that doesn't collapse under the scrutiny of historians, use this one. It is the memory of an organization that has decided to remember even what it cannot use. Sounds crazy, right? But think about it. The church keeps the victories because victories serve to teach. And they keep the failures because failures are a warning. They keep the letters that were answered, and also the letters that were sent back in humiliating silence. They keep the drafts. Oh, the drafts are the best part, where sentences are crossed out, rewritten, then crossed out again, where the writer's hand trembled just enough to confess a deadly truth. That certainty, even that of a pope, is only an ambition, not a state of being. They keep the maps that showed the right way, and the maps that were completely wrong but necessary to cover another truth. They keep the saints who were cast into statues, and the people who lived like saints but were gently brushed aside. Why? Because their miracles weren't neat, their visions weren't beautiful enough, and their tongues were too honest to be transcribed into the sacred calendars. I learned the word restraint in this very place, in the way a gardener learns to understand the rotation of seasons. The church does not easily destroy things that go against its will. No. Burning is for the public square. Down here in the underground, they delay. That is the most misunderstood virtue, and also their most dangerous habit. Delay can be wisdom. When you refuse to give a verdict before gathering enough facts. But delay, my friend, can also be fear-wearing expensive shoes. In these corridors, you will find both. And sometimes they hold hands so convincingly that even the most formidable scholars cannot pry their fingers apart. That is why the lamps here are modest, and the chairs are simple enough to hurt your back. Magnificent rooms often give birth to deceitful, flowery sentences, and there is no room for that trash here. This place only believes in nouns, dates, handwriting, and seals. It only believes in verbs after they have waited long enough for their pride to rot away. There is one particular shelf where the files are bound in coarse linen instead of luxurious leather. They are thinner, more shrinking, labeled with a code that reeks of caution. Do you know what's inside? Those are the quiet records of images that were never hung up. A sketch by a student of a Renaissance master, drawing a saint whose eyes aren't worshiping but are staring in accusation. A blotchy ink stain depicting a pope not standing in blessing, but gripping the bench with both hands like a mortal, terrified by an earthquake. These are not heretical images deserving of the fire. Not at all. They are simply truths the church didn't know how to explain. So, they weren't burned, they were wrapped up. What is the difference between erasing and delaying? It is the difference between an organization that fears time and an organization that believes time will solve everything for them. And don't think everything down here is high religious drama. Sometimes the irony lies in the smallest trifles. There are bills of sale. There are shipping receipts stained by melting snow from the years when the Alps became the grave for horse-drawn convoys. There are inventories scribbled by men trembling with fear as secret crates were carried away under the flags of distant nations, then returned under the terms of bribes in windowless rooms. There are scraps of paper reeking of sea salt, as if the ocean had argued with them and lost. And there are names, surnames you will never find in any history textbook. They are the little people who wrote to Rome, simply because they had no one else in the world to write to. And Rome, thanks to its great prestige or its cunning wisdom, kept it all. Even the letters that could make the church turn beet red if anyone dared to read them aloud on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. But Rome doesn't read them aloud. Rome just quietly puts them in a drawer, locks it, and lets time do its work. And I am just the person holding the ring of keys, cleaning up the ruins of that waiting. Sometimes in the evening, when the last scholar has signed out in the tattered logbook at the door, and the green felt spread out is as silent as a dead meadow, I often pull up a low chair, sit down and listen. If you keep enough silence, you can hear this building thinking. No joke. It's not exactly a physical sound. It's a type of tacit agreement, a silent consensus between boulder and time. If anyone dares to tell you the archive is just a warehouse, smile at them. Smile the way you do at a 5-year-old trying to explain the mechanics of lightning. Listen, a warehouse holds objects. An archive, it holds promises. That is 10,000 times harder. It requires an imagination not borrowed from mythology, a humility not accompanied by cowardice, and the courage to leave an envelope sealed. Why? Because tearing it open would give you an answer, but rob you of a question that your generation is not yet worthy of asking. The more I clean, the more I realize a chilling truth. This archive is not merely a place for papers. It is the church's second confessional. You know the first confessional, right? The little wooden booth where people whisper sins, receive forgiveness, and everything vanishes into thin air. But this second confessional, it is for truths too fragile to endure sunlight, too volatile for rigid doctrines, and too haunting for priests to dare preach from the pulpit. Here, no one seeks forgiveness. Here, the goal is preservation. Every file is a silent admission. Every drawer is a quiet absolution. The church, through its worldly wisdom or its ultimate fear, has collected all the questions it cannot answer and then set them aside. Not destroyed, only delayed. Like saying, not this time. This world isn't big enough to harbor you. People are always obsessed with the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Vatican's infamous list of prohibited books. They see it as a ghastly blacklist. But believe me, being on that prohibited list turns out to be an honor. How much do you have to terrify the church? For them to drag you into the light, to condemn you, and burn your books. A prohibited book is a known book. But down here, there is another reality far more ruthless. The church calls it indices temporani, temporary indexes. I prefer to call it by another name, the invisible library. The books in this area aren't condemned to the fire, nor are they approved. They are stripped of all decoration, bound in plain leather or tattered coarse paper. They are thrown into a purgatory of knowledge. They aren't feared enough for people to oppose them. They are only feared enough for people to ignore them. And in that ultimate ignoring, their authors disappear, not in the violence of a sacred flame, but in the stillness of dust. Let me tell you about a Polish Jesuit in the 18th century. A man so pious it was pitiful. He didn't mock the Bible. He spent his whole life trying to reconcile Genesis with fresh astronomical theories. He timidly asked the question, could God's 6 days of creation be a metaphor? Could each day be an era lasting millions of years? A humble question, a desperate attempt to protect faith against the storm of science. And the Vatican's response, as cold and unfeeling as a surgical knife. In the margin of the manuscript, a clerk scribbled exactly one line: to be reconsidered under quieter circumstances. Quieter circumstances. That is the most polite way an organization says they want to bury you alive. The monk's manuscript was never banned, never published, never read. He was forced to wait for centuries in silence. And there was another, a 17th century Benedictine abbot. He wrote a thick theological tome, arguing that Catholicism could learn from the intensity of Protestant prayer. He wrote with all his devotion. And the Vatican's verdict? 4 short words. Excellent but untimely. I swear to you, that word untimely is sharper than any guillotine in the French Revolution. It doesn't accuse you of being wrong, but it doesn't allow you to be right. It declares you a ghost while you are still breathing. It is a sentence of exile, not to another continent, but to another era, an era that might never arrive. I began to see these books as living beings, each one as a child abandoned at the church door in the middle of a snowy night, unacknowledged, waiting forever in the cold. Each one is a heartbeat trapped in dry ink. I can almost hear them screaming silently as I pass by. Why not now? When will our era come? Denounced as a heretic, you enter history along with the majestic flame. Deemed untimely, you vanish into nothingness. History, as it turns out, is not only needed by what people shout in the square. It is shaped by what is forced into silence under these damn vaults. What truly haunts me isn't the pages. Paper is just paper, no matter how many centuries it's soaked in. What stifles me every time I stand in the middle of this invisible library is the thought of the flesh and blood people behind them. The Jesuit monk, wondering if God created the world through eras instead of tedious days. the abbot who dared to see beauty in the prayers of those considered heathens, the friar trying to mold theology and nature into a single block. How do you think they died? Did they draw their last breath with ultimate bitterness, believing their life's passion had been tossed into the trash bin of an ungrateful church? Or did they hold on to a ruthless hope, fragile as a spider silk, that their work wasn't destroyed, but was being kept for an era not yet formed? And if that hope is real, then it is still surviving down here, my friends. In the silent drawers, under the gray linen covers, the manuscripts lie there like corpses awaiting the day of resurrection. The Church's decision not to burn these works, but to silently preserve them, has opened up a philosophy deeper and scarier than censorship. It shows that the Vatican believes in something extremely ironic, that time itself is the greatest purifier. What is considered toxic heresy today may be harmless tomorrow, and the day after it may become saving truth. What was untimely in the 17th century might be enlightenment in the 22nd. Therefore, they don't burn. They hide them away like seeds sown in cold soil, patiently waiting for the spring of some future century. When I realized that, a chill ran down my spine, because if this invisible library is real, and I am standing right in the middle of it, then the history we proudly learn in school hasn't actually finished yet. It's not a completed painting. It's a waiting room. Our current era, with the internet, with AI, with the supreme arrogance that we have understood the past, we are dead wrong. Locked in those drawers are voices powerful enough to rewrite the entire way we perceive the world, if only they were allowed to speak. But the Church, perhaps through masterly wisdom or cowardly fear, has chosen to force them to continue waiting. There are days when, stepping in here to do nameless tasks, smoothing a folded corner of paper, patting a loose book spine so it returns to its place, I feel a strange tenderness. No history with a giant capital H will happen here today. The world out there will still be noisy, busy, tearing each other apart, arrogant and blind, completely unconcerned with the great patience taking place right beneath its feet. And you know what? That's perfectly fine. There are professions that live off the applause of the crowd, and there are professions that live off breath. This archive belongs to the second type. If you're here long enough, you will hear a message running through these stone walls like an indelible watermark. The Church remembers everything. Remember that carefully. Remembers everything. But that doesn't mean they will tell everything. Or at least, not tell it when we scream and demand it. And if that promise makes you angry, if you think that's deceitful, then try considering the opposite option. Forgetting, my friends, is a cheap luxury reserved only for those who don't have to be responsible. Regardless of the role the Church has played in humanity's long drama of power, be it tyrant or savior, they have not allowed themselves the right to forget. The nameless door for which I hold the key is the strongest evidence. And there was one night, as I prepared to turn off the last lamp, I stopped at the hinge of the first room and looked back. The long corridors held their breath like a giant choir staring intently, waiting for the hand of the conductor. And in a split second, I had the overwhelming feeling that this place was looking back at me, Millions of pages, thousands of centuries, converging into a single sharp gaze. I suddenly remembered the scrap of paper on that unlabeled file. This is not yet for history. You know, our century is writing such notes too. We like the illusion that we are braver and more transparent than those who came before. But no, that drawer is always there, slightly ajar, begging a future generation, those whose faces we will never live long enough to see, to please forgive us for the truths that we could not yet say out loud. I step out into the daylight. St. Peter's Dome stands tall, reigning over the sky. Tourists flock to raise their phones and cameras to the sky, trying to capture every glamorous frame. Not one of them bothers to turn back and look into the darkness I just stepped out of. And that, ironically, is entirely appropriate. The archive is not a stage for display. It is not a museum of trophies. It is a silent vow. Discovering it to me felt like the first glimpse of a gatekeeper meeting eternity. The Vatican archives don't imprison demons. It is a waiting room, a purgatory of thought, where miracles are still patiently lying in wait behind the locks. It's small, made of metal, with a very unsightly dent on the side. No gilded handles, no carved patterns, not even a single curly Latin line to prove its divine existence. It looks exactly like a medical record cabinet in a shabby high school rather than the nerve center of the Catholic Church. Visitors walk past it every day, their eyes gliding over that mundane ugliness to search for flashier things. Yet, my friends, inside that humble, dented cabinet is one of the collections of documents that chills me the most. It doesn't contain sex scandals. It doesn't contain bloody decrees, nor is it dry theological debates. It contains something much stranger and more terrifying. Miracles that were never approved. The Catholic Church has always appeared as a giant supernatural censoring machine. If you want to canonize someone, you need a miracle, and Rome is not easy. They have bishops, theological commissions, medical experts, and even devil's advocates just to debunk phenomena. They will scrutinize whether it was a true intervention from God or just the mistake of a quack doctor, the superstition of the uneducated, or the trickery of scammers. This process lasts decades. Rome never rushes with the supernatural. And I open that cabinet expecting files on debunked scammers. But no, not at all. There isn't a single cheap plot or fabrication here. The files are full of seriousness, submitted by priests and bishops themselves, with dozens of witness signatures, sometimes accompanied by photos and relics. They have been read, they have been checked, but then they were tossed in here, not declared false, but not recognized as truth either. They were simply locked up. Take the first file I pulled out as an example. The early 1800s in a remote rural area of Spain. A poor, ragged woman claimed she had been visited. Not by the Virgin Mary, not by a winged angel holding a flaming sword, but by a figure she described as melancholy, nameless, just a mass of pure light. The neighbors swore an oath that they saw her place her rough hand on a dying child, and only hours later, the child leaped out of the sickbed, completely healthy. The local clergy were terrified. They took meticulous notes, sending letters to Rome with ultimate humility. "Sirs, something inexplicable has happened. We beg for guidance." Can you guess how the Vatican replied? An applause? An investigative delegation? No. Rome's response was as cold as a scalpel. The handwriting in the margin of the report was a single line. "There is no canonical framework for such a phenomenon. File closed." Do you see the irony here? That miracle could be real, but because God, or whatever power, forgot to read the code of canon law before granting the blessing, Rome decided to turn its back. The miracle was robbed of its voice, stuffed into an envelope, and ended up in a steel cabinet. Or look at the year 1927 in a barren village in Africa. A horrific drought devastated everything. A desperate priest led a procession, carrying a piece of a relic of some small, nameless saint. That night the sky cracked open, rain poured down, not just on their village, but over a vast region. The parched fields turned into puddles of life. Haggard faces looked up at the sky, drinking every drop of cool water. The priest was joyous, but also anxious as he wrote the report to the highest center of power. The Vatican's conclusion? Culturally influenced, not to be pursued further. That rain that saved thousands of lives, that extreme joy, was downgraded to an ambiguity, cataloged, archived, and buried. The more I read, the more I realized a bitter truth. The reason Rome hides these miracles is not because they are fakes. It's because they are too hard to control. They don't follow the Church's KPIs. They don't fit the script that the Vatican has painstakingly written over centuries. Wrong timing, wrong location, witnesses too low class, or the healing method too bizarre. Why risk causing a rift in a solid doctrinal system when you can just toss it in a cabinet and lock it? But, my friends, this is what truly haunts me. What makes me shiver when my hands touch those yellowed pages? They didn't burn them. If the Vatican truly believed these were the ramblings of madmen, they could have tossed them into the fireplace. They could have erased them from the flow of history. But no. They meticulously labeled, classified, and stored them. Why? Because deep down, even the most powerful officials in Rome are afraid. They are afraid that they might be true. This cabinet is not a dump for trickery. It is a prison holding possibilities too fragile to be exposed to sunlight. Every single file lying in here, from the visions of Italian nuns about a Virgin Mary who doesn't heal but only grants the strength to endure a cholera pandemic, to the prophetic earthquake dreams of a South American boy, all are whispering through the metal casing. Not yet time, perhaps one day. Rome is very cautious when judging truth. That is true. But you see, they are equally cowardly when they have to judge something as false. As I closed the final drawer, my hands shook slightly, the weight of tens of thousands of tiny voices screaming in wonder, hoping for a nod from the supreme being on earth, only to receive a cold shoulder in the end. The Vatican doesn't just hide sex scandals or murky funds. They hide the very wonder of this world. Not because it doesn't exist, but because they fear that it truly exists, and it is not under their control. If you keep venturing deeper into the cavernous gut of the Vatican archives, you'll notice the atmosphere begin to shift. Initially, it's just dry, stable air with a faint scent of old parchment, dust, and a trace of candle wax. But as you cross into darker thresholds, where the stone walls narrow as if to crush you, and the lamplight fades into a murky gloom, you will feel it. Something ancient and cloying. It is as if despair itself has seeped deep into every slab of stone clinging to the mortar, making the silence here heavy and suffocatingly thick. I felt it most clearly standing before a room marked with 2 Latin words, written in a scribbled hand that looked almost apologetic: tempor pestis, the period of disease. We, the modern people, usually only know of the Black Death through cold numbers in history books: 40 million, 50 million, or 100 million corpses, entire towns wiped out, Europe reshaped by fear. It is a statistical disaster. But here, in this hidden basement of the Vatican, the plague is not a collection of soulless numbers. It has a voice. Hundreds of moaning voices. They do not come from kings or plague doctors wearing crow-beaked masks. They come from priests, monks, nuns, and the lowliest of the common folk. Their words are fragile and desperate, transcribed, bound into volumes, and preserved, not to guide theological doctrine, but simply because someone at the Vatican realized a brutal truth. Even prayers never answered by God have a right to exist. The directories here look pathetic. They are wrapped only in coarse linen, tied with frayed leather cords, cowering shyly beside the splendor of gold-encrusted papal bulls. But as I untied the first cord, my hand froze. I was holding the faint heartbeat of history. The first letter is dated 1348. The author is an anonymous monk at a small monastery in France. You can see his panic through every trembling stroke, the ink blots where he stayed too long to catch his breath or perhaps to cry. "We cannot administer the sacrament of confession to the dying fast enough," he wrote. "There are no last rites, only the rattling of breath." He spoke of a cruel game they had to play every morning. The survivors gathered on the chapel steps, drawing names from a wooden bowl to see who would be the unlucky soul forced to carry the rotting corpses to the mass graves today. They turned death into a lottery, not because they were cruel, but because they were naive, so exhausted. They had no emotion left, but it was his next sentence that truly pierced through me. "We fear death, but even more, we fear the silence of heaven." Read that sentence again. That lament wipes away the 600-year gap. These are not NPCs in a chronicle. These are flesh and blood humans, utterly confused, screaming at a gray sky and realizing no one is home. Turning each page, I was submerged in a sea of despair. Priests begged Rome for guidance, but Rome, ironically, was busy locking its doors tight. Monks confessed that their choirs were thinning out and out, until only a single lonely voice echoed through the silent cathedral. Nuns described sewing shrouds with their own hands until their fingertips bled, praying as they sewed that the scythe of death might knock on their door a little later. One unsigned letter sent from near Avignon recounted a sight that turned my blood cold. Over 30 children abandoned at the cathedral steps. Their families were all dead, their names unknown to anyone. The local bishop wrote to Rome, in a panic. What should be done with them? There was no official answer from the Vatican. Empty. But in the margin, in the tiny ink hand of someone from a later generation, was written, "They were adopted. 2 survivors." That's it. 2 human beings survived from the ashes. History highlighted their weak pulse, refusing to let them sink into oblivion. There was no miracle from God here, only the raw compassion of humans reaching out to save one another in the middle of hell. The next file took me to a convent in Germany. The nuns there cared for the sick, until their own numbers were nearly wiped out. One by one they collapsed, and those still living buried their sisters with their own hands in the convent garden. The final part of the letter reads like a last will. Now there are only 2 of us. We sing the divine office as best we can, though our voices are trembling. If this book is found, know that we tried to hold on to our faith until the very end. The end. No sequel, only a deathly silence. The brutal honesty of these records makes even a cynic like me falter. They didn't try to cram empty theological explanations into the pain. They didn't preach that the plague was God's punishment to scare the faithful. They only spoke a bitter truth. The priests had lost hope. The nuns were crying, and the monks were praying to a completely empty heaven. A priest in northern Italy wrote a report to his diocese confessing that his villagers had stopped coming to Mass, not because they were heretics or worshipped Satan, but because they were too tired to hope. They tell me their prayers bounce back like echoes in a dry well. I kneel with them, but even my own words sound hollow. That man in the black cassock was recording the crushing weight of being abandoned by the Almighty. And do you know what made me shiver most? It was a small, crumpled scrap of paper found among the administrative reports. The handwriting was uneven, the smudged scrawl of a child. It said, "Father says we will see heaven soon. I am so scared. Please pray for me." No name, no date, only pure fear frozen across the centuries. That child turned to dust long ago, but their cry is still here. Why did the Vatican keep these? These records do not glorify the authority of the Church. They strip bare a church that is trembling, helpless, and mute. But the decision to lock them in this room, temper pestis, is itself a belated confession from Rome. They are telling us we must also remember the times when faith was crushed, when heaven seemed silent. The Black Death changed human history. But standing in this basement, I don't see history. I only see the human soul at its most tattered and fragile, pressed dry into lines of ink. The silence in this room is not emptiness. It is the scream of tens of millions who have been locked away, waiting for a response that will never come. The Vatican archives have a strange talent. They know how to make even the most arrogant scholars bow their heads in humility. At first glance, you're deceived by an illusion of absolute order. Centuries of blood and glory are tamely domesticated by index cards, leather-bound spines, and brass-locked cabinets. Everything is tidy, but occasionally you stumble upon something that refuses to lie still in that structure of lies, something that resists certainty. It was the chill on my neck the day I found a cabinet bearing the inscription Depositia non canonizzata. Unrecognized prophecies. Like the metal cabinet for miracles, this cabinet is intentionally ugly. Where other shelves proudly boast shiny brass labels, this one has only a scarred metal plate where the nameplate was pried off long ago. Its wood is riddled with scars, the keyhole distorted by hundreds of years of hurried key turning. I opened it, hoping to find tattered administrative invoices. But no, tucked inside were 5 folders. They weren't tied with red silk ribbons or white linen like normal documents. They were wrapped tight in thin black cloth. My friends, they didn't look like archival documents. They looked like books in mourning. I carefully unwrapped the first black band, fearing its darkness might crumble. Inside was an ambered parchment, the trembling handwriting of a hermit from the early centuries of Christianity, living alone in the barren Egyptian desert. The record was fragmented, interrupted by hunger or hallucinations. He wrote of a city of faith that would one day tremble. Not because of pagan armies, not because of the enemy's fire, but that city would crack from within by the very weight of memories demanding to burst out. Then the vision cut out midway. And in the margin, a Vatican official from centuries later delivered a blunt verdict in Latin. Too vague. Do not pursue. File closed. But hey, why not throw it away? If it was just the rambling of a starving madman, why did someone go to the trouble of wrapping it in black cloth and hiding it here? The next folder punched straight into my mind. It was dated 1847. The report's author had a dramatic and utterly panicked tone. He saw birds made of metal circling around cities burning in silence. Think about it, friends. The year 1847. The concept of bombers, of air forces, of deadly bombs falling from the sky didn't even exist in the human vocabulary. This miserable man was trapped in a nightmare for which he had no words. He described desperate crowds fleeing through streets choking on ash, their screams swallowed by a silent sky. Reading it with the eyes of someone living in the 21st century, the smell of World War II, smoke, hit my nose directly. But what did Rome think? The Vatican's response sat right in the margin. Ambiguous metaphor, likely allegorical. Oh, Rome! You thought it was poetry. Another parchment from 1931 warned of a leader with no crown, but with millions of voices, a man not of royal blood, not anointed by God, but who swallowed nations using only words amplified by the fanaticism of the crowd. Only a few years after that prophecy, Hitler and Mussolini drowned Europe in a sea of blood through microphones and radio broadcasts. But what did Rome write in 1931? Too metaphorical. Source unstable. However, the prophecy that made me catch my breath came from an anonymous nun at a cloistered convent in northern Italy. The report was only a few lines. The stones will speak, and those who have forgotten will hear them. She claimed to have seen massive churches collapsing from within, not due to war or fire, but because filthy truths hidden for so long finally broke through their casing, forcing the walls to explode. The Vatican once again concluded, "Witness unstable." I close my eyes and imagine the shocking church scandals of recent decades. The stones have indeed begun to speak. and the weight of secrets is truly pulling down the cathedrals. You see, Rome always walks a tightrope between two abysses when facing prophecy. When those visions reinforce their power, comfort the masses, and easily turn into lucrative pilgrimage festivals like Fatima or Lourdes, they canonize it. But when the vision reeks of collapse, of blood, of hard-to-swallow truths, they brush it aside. They don't dare condemn it as heresy, just in case it's actually the Word of God, but they don't dare recognize it because it could cause a rebellion. They choose to blindfold history, waiting, but the masterpiece of horror lies in the final folder. No context, no date, no author's name, only a single line floating in the middle of the parchment. When the shepherd is silent, the fierce wolf will speak with the voice of an angel. That sentence hung in the stale air of the archive, sharp as a razor blade. What does it mean? Is it a warning about the cowardly silence of religious leaders? Is it a prophecy about dictators masquerading as saviors? Not a single Vatican archivist dared to write a commentary for it. It was thrown in here, detained. I sat petrified before those words. Shepherd silent. Wolf speaking in an angel's voice. It's not just a warning for the past, it's aimed directly at us right now. When truth is stifled, when those who should speak choose to stay silent to protect their interests, the cruelest lies will always appear under the guise of holiness and morality. The Vatican doesn't keep this quote because they believe it. They keep it because they are terrified that it describes them. As I carefully rewrapped the black bands around the folders, I realized that Rome's waiting is also a form of fear. These prophecies remind us of one thing. The divine, if it exists, doesn't always speak in pleasant tones that fit the catechism. Sometimes it screams truths that are too brutal, too unstable. I walked out of the room, and the silence of the archive was no longer the silence of death. It was the rasping breath of wolves with angel voices, patiently waiting for the darkness to fall. Among the countless bookshelves and vaults of the Vatican archives, you will notice a cruel pattern. Sometimes, the most shocking discoveries do not appear under magnificent gold-encrusted covers. They come with a nakedness that makes you feel pain. No ancient seals, no dramatic Latin inscriptions. I was holding a plain, yellowed envelope, its edges curled and thin as a dry leaf. On the outside, a hurried hand had scratched across the paper. Ad Miser, to mercy. No recipient address. Inside was a page without a signature or date. The ink varied in darkness as if the writer had pressed the nib hard in a fit of choked-up emotion. It was not a letter. It didn't even follow any liturgical format. It was raw, desperate. It was a confession without a priest, a cry in the middle of an empty congregation. Its opening line punched me straight in the chest. I no longer know who I am talking to when I kneel. Stop for a moment and feel the weight of that. Friends, these are not the words of a heretic or a subversive. This is exhaustion. The ultimate exhaustion when faith bleeds without any response from the divine realm. The writer, perhaps a priest, who spent his life in a black cassock, a bishop fed up with secret meetings reeking of incense, or a monk worn down by silence, was pouring out his soul. "We dress our answers in robes and incense," the anonymous soul continued, "but behind them, I only hear delay." There was no outrage in these lines, only a dense melancholy. And then the final paragraph rang out like a brutal warning bell. "If we have failed to be holy, let us at least be honest. Holiness will return when we stop pretending it never left." The end. Why would the Vatican keep something so dangerous and vulnerable? Why not burn it to protect the illusion of a perfect faith? Because someone, at some point in history, realized that disillusionment, when written with ultimate honesty, is not weakness. It is ultimate courage. The Vatican keeps it as a mirror, a silent confession that faith is not destroyed by doubt. It is ravaged by pretense. And speaking of pretense and delay, walk with me to the area near the center of the archive. Here I found a wooden chest. It was rough, blackened by oil and time, locked with a rusty iron latch that looked like a poor farmer's potato crate. It was an outsider among the polished cabinets holding medieval treaties. But the handwritten tag tied to the handle revealed its identity. Memoranda, interns, non-C, internal memoranda, councils that were never held. Welcome to the cemetery of ghosts. Inside this rough chest were drafts, agendas, the phantom meetings of bishops and cardinals, people who never actually sat down together. This is a church standing on the precipice of courage, but then deciding to turn back out of cowardice. I pulled out a file from the 1700s. It proposed a council to reconcile science and doctrine. A cardinal had written beautiful lines. "We must not fear the movement of the stars, but learn to see the sky as the language of God." If this council had happened, it would have reshaped history centuries before Galileo was exonerated. But the brilliant red ink of cowardice was noted in the margin. "Perhaps the time will be right in a century." Delay, oblivion. Or look at the bloody file from the 1930s. A proposal for a council to condemn fascism, totalitarianism, and to protect human dignity regardless of race. The bishops saw clearly the darkness swallowing Europe. The church could have struck a thunderous blow to wake humanity before World War II turned the world into a slaughterhouse. But what did Rome write? "World situation unstable, too risky, silence advised." The council was canceled. Millions died, and history trudged on in the stench of burning bodies. Furthermore, a late 19th century draft proposed condemning the pseudoscience of racism and the exploitative colonial rule in Africa and Asia. The words were powerful. All are created in the image of God. And Rome's conclusion could be interpreted politically. Delay. These drafts are covered in stains, dripping candle wax, and hurried crossouts. They are like a chest swelling up to scream loud, only to slowly deflate, holding its breath and staying mute forever. The year is 1871. A religious order in Europe is accused of abuse. Witnesses screamed. Evidence was collected so extensively it could have formed a mountain. The investigative committee recorded every testimony, every cry of pain, every recommendation for reform. But look at this final line. It is sharp as a knife stabbing justice. Proceeding would risk causing a greater scandal than delaying. The matter will be considered quietly at a more appropriate time. And guess what? That appropriate time never came. The silence is permanent. The church was not blind, my friends, nor were they ignorant. They simply placed the scandal on one side of a scale and the truth on the other. And in the end, they decided that silence was safer. A calculation so cold, it would make the devil tip his hat. In the late 19th century, missionaries sent reports back from Africa. Forced labor, colonial brutality, exploitation under the guise of proselytizing. Bishops argued heatedly. Some trembled with outrage, wanting to speak out. But the final verdict remained. Silence. Do not interfere in politics. This ledger does not hide the debate. It meticulously records that cowardice. But what made my hands shake the most was this entry, 1943. In the eye of the storm of World War II, reports of the deportation of Jews in Italy flooded into the Vatican. Names, families torn apart, trains leaving in the darkness toward concentration camps. And here's the brief, unsigned note, like a gasping breath. Knowledge exists, no voice. We pray, but we do not speak. We pray, but we do not speak. Can you feel the weight of a million silences? Knowledge without a voice. A memory imprisoned in leather binding, never uttered aloud in public. The silence here is not an accident. It is a policy. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deliberate refusal. Every unannounced entry is actually an eloquent declaration. We know everything. We have discussed it thoroughly, and we choose to ignore it. This is more terrifying than any buried secret. Secrets can be unearthed. Scandals can be attacked, but silence, it is an empty void. And you cannot attack or destroy a void. The Vatican is so paradoxical. They could have burned these files, erased all traces of hesitation. But no, they keep them, preserving them more meticulously than silver or gold. Perhaps deep within this institution, they understand that even silence will one day have to be accounted for. These ledgers are like a giant confessional for the church itself, a place where they confess not what they did, but what they chose to stand by and watch. But unlike human confession, these pages bring no absolution. They simply wait, waiting for eyes brave enough to see through the dust of cowardice. Do you hear it? The whisper from the pages. There was a scribe centuries ago who could not stand this bureaucratic composure. In a small, hidden corner, he secretly added a tiny line. May God forgive our silence. That is no longer the record of an organization. It is the heart-wrenching cry of an individual suffocated by the very system they serve. Silence does not preserve unity, my friends. It corrodes the soul from within. History is not only shaped by resounding proclamations. Sometimes the loudest sound in history is the sound that was never made. Do you smell that? Amidst an environment saturated with the scent of rotting parchment and wax candles, this metal cabinet reeks of technology, of modern secrecy. There are no rusty brass locks here. It requires a code. A cold electronic beep replaces the clatter of a key. People whisper to me that this cabinet is newer than the archive itself. It was erected to imprison sensitive things, not dark curses or demons, friends. Inside these cold drawers are folders labeled very innocently, pending canonization. The Catholic Church has a canonization process stricter than selecting intelligence agents. Background checks, moral verification, miracle confirmation, theological scrutiny. Any stain can ruin everything. Being canonized means you become a perfect template for millions of believers to bow down and follow. But as I flip through the files locked in here, I realize a sickeningly ironic truth. Holiness alone is not enough. The church doesn't just need holy people. They need convenient holiness, a holiness that is obedient, safe, and does not bite back at the hand of the institution. And those who fail the obedience test, they end up here, becoming the saints who never were, floating between recognition and oblivion, detained behind steel and silence. Take this man, for example, a bishop living in the fire pit of World War II. He gambled his life to hide Jewish refugees in monasteries on the edge of occupied zones. Thousands of pages overflow with the tearful gratitude of survivors. "He saved us when the world turned its back," they wrote. A true hero, right? An undeniable saint. But wait. Interspersed with the praise, Vatican investigators found his personal letters. In them, he criticized the Holy See's diplomacy. He questioned whether the Vatican's silence regarding the genocide was complicity. Do you know what the final verdict was? A marginal note reads, "Heroic in action, but his writings risk causing division." Bam. The process was suspended, stamped, locked. His holiness was obscured not by sin, but by honesty. Or another case, a female mystic from the 1920s. She had brilliant visions of God's love. But unfortunately, her visions were too generous. She wrote of kneeling in prayer beside a Muslim and a Jew, all facing one supreme being. In the 1920s, that thought was considered a time bomb. The Vatican assessed beloved locally, theologically premature, too inclusive for a narrow century, so she was quietly set aside. But the file that makes my skin crawl belongs to a laywoman in Latin America, living through a bloody civil war. She used her bare hands and her voice to block gun barrels, hid children from forced conscription, and gave her last morsel of food to the destitute. The local bishop adored her. However, her diary pages burned with a holy rage. She didn't just curse the corrupt government. She cursed the corruption inside the church. She wrote, "If the house of God cannot protect the innocent, then the stones will rise up to judge it." The Vatican's remark? Extremely brief, extremely cruel. Her holiness is obscured by her tone. Tone, my friends. She saved lives, but because she didn't use sweet, pleasant words with the gentleman in Rome, her name must stay in this drawer. There's more. A poor village priest whose file was suspended because he dared to preach that the kingdom of heaven belongs to the poor and not the powerful. risks encouraging disobedience. A young nurse who died of exhaustion fighting a pandemic, called a living saint by her patients, but whose file was frozen just because she dared to criticize the church for reacting too slowly. She wasn't wrong. She just said words that were inconvenient. Standing in this room is like standing in a cemetery of ghosts who have not yet moved on. They are not the condemned sent to hell. They are the ones refused recognition. This poses a question that makes even the most brilliant theologians break into a cold sweat. What is true holiness? Is it compliance, blind obedience, or the courage to challenge evil? Can anger be sacred? Is rebellion against injustice, even injustice from the church itself, divine? The files in this locked cabinet are screaming, yes, but the church, with its calculated slowness, only murmurs back, not yet time. But you know what's wonderful? The Vatican did not destroy these files. They keep them, waiting, always waiting. Waiting for a day when this world, or the church itself, is big enough to accept that holiness isn't always polite and safe. Holiness is sometimes a claw tearing at hypocrisy. Until then, the saints who never were still lie here, behind the cold steel. They don't need Rome's crown to be holy. Perhaps living and dying for love and truth without caring for a title is the greatest miracle of all. Look, even the air here seems to be holding its breath. We are standing in the oldest and most fragile corner of the archives. There are no polished leather ledgers or majestic parchment scrolls. These rickety shelves hold only thin folders with tattered edges and weak, yellowed covers. But do not let their pathetic appearance deceive you. The neat Latin script on the lid of this box carries a power capable of rewriting history. Act suspensor, suspended acts. If the papal bulls read, echoing from the balcony of St. Peter's Square, are proclamations of certainty, then these torn pages, they whisper of hesitation. These are decrees that were never executed, letters without seals, decisions braked sharply midway. They are the breaths the church drew deep into its chest, but never dared to exhale. Opening them is like finding a candle extinguished too soon. There is no light, only the lingering, acrid smell of smoke. The year is 1623, a draft of an apostolic letter of apology. An apology to whom? Giordano Bruno. The great philosopher burned alive at the stake in 1600 for the crime of heresy. This draft is unbelievably frank. It admits Bruno's search was sincere and that the church is grieved by it. A shocking display of humility from 17th century Rome. But look at the bottom of the page. A slash of red ink and a marginal note. Do not publish. Await further discussion. How long did that further discussion last? Several centuries. No apology was issued. The confession died in its infancy, right there on the desk. Do you want to see how the church missed saving the world? Look at this draft from 1892. At this time, the pseudo-science of race was beginning to spread its venom in Europe, clearing the path for the genocidal tragedies that followed. This draft is a prophetic thunderclap. It declares loudly that no race is inferior, for all are created in the image of God. It calls for the total uprooting of racism. If this had been published, history might have taken a different turn. But once again, cowardice triumphed. Here is their note. Could be interpreted politically. Brilliant. To avoid offending political powers, they stuffed this draft into a box and locked it away. The fear of controversy always weighed more than the urgency of human lives. The mid-19th century. The Industrial Revolution pushed millions of workers and children into extreme exploitation. A decree was drafted to demand fair wages and human rights. Its end? Hold until there is transparency regarding economic impact. The early 20th century. A manifesto condemning the abuse of power and clerical privilege within the church itself. Revolutionary words, daring to expose the internal rot. The verdict? Too destabilizing, delayed indefinitely. You see, what connects these scraps of paper is not a failure of thought, but a failure of courage. Doctrine is not only shaped by divine revelations, it is also kneaded by human cowardice. Look closely at these pages. The smudges where ink was blotted in a hurry, in a panic. The holes where razors scraped away lines already written. Sentences broken off as if the writer had hurled the pen away in sheer terror. Holding them in your hand, you are holding a fossil of fear. But, my friends, I must admit an ironic truth. The fact that the Vatican did not burn these things is itself a twisted confession. They have filed away their own hesitation. They preserve these half-formed thoughts, like candles that were never lit, waiting for someone in the future brave enough to strike a match. Does truth need to wait for permission? Does justice have to watch for an auspicious hour to appear? The last folder I found in this corner. It has only a single fragment, half a sentence. It writes, "The church must confess." The end. It stops right in the middle of the ink. Confess to complicity, confess to crimes, or confess to its own cold-blooded silence, we will never know. But this fragment remains here, like a headless ghost screaming in silence. Look at these dust motes. History is not only made of what is shouted over loudspeakers. The truths we need most are often the things stuffed into drawers. These act suspensor are the very essence of this archive. The smoke rising from fires that were never allowed to burn. When you think of the Vatican archives, what do you imagine? An impregnable theological fortress, right? Shelves groaning under the weight of dogmas, laws, councils, and bulls. A suffocating architecture built with faith and autocracy over centuries. Yes, for the most part, it is like that. But deep in this giant maze, at the end of an old service passage, there is a room that shatters all those expectations. This room contains no law. It contains no theology. It contains the mysterious. Look at the words carved on these drawers. Extraordinaria. Extraordinary things. A word so vague it stirs the most burning instinct of curiosity in each of us. But when I pull this drawer out, the reality will blow your mind. You expected grimoires, curses, or demonic seals. Not at all. These are reports, thousands of reports on the inexplicable, visions, apparitions, impossible healings, ghostly voices whispering from the void, or brilliant lights tearing through the sky. They were sent from bishops, priests, and lay people trembling with terror or awe. But Do you know the most ridiculous thing? All these supernatural, earth-shattering events capable of changing human perception were recorded by the Vatican in a bureaucratic, cold, and boring prose that is enough to put you to sleep. And here, the greatest highlight of divine bureaucracy, at the bottom of nearly every report, written in a neat, soulless hand, is this refrain: further investigation is unnecessary at this time. Brilliant, do you see? A great mantra of evasion. These phenomena are not condemned as heresy. They are not exposed as hoaxes. And of course, they are absolutely not hailed as miracles. They are thrown into a limbo. Their existence is acknowledged, but they are left to gather dust. Look at the file from 1678 from Sicily. Dozens of people experienced the same nightmare for 7 consecutive weeks. A ghost in a crimson robe weeping before a burning manuscript. The local bishop, panicked, sent an express report to Rome, convinced that the spiritual world was sending a bloody message. And Rome, with the composure of a banker refusing a loan, replied, "Pastoral caution is advised, no further investigation." And that was it. The dreams faded away. People continued living. But that event was crucified here, in ink and paper, detained in eternal silence. Or like another report from Brazil in the 1950s, also with anomalous phenomena beyond understanding, which eventually suffered the same fate, lying neatly in a folder with the line, "No further investigation necessary." My friends, people still think the Church craves miracles to reinforce faith, but these extraordinaria drawers tell a crueler truth. Miracles are actually a massive nuisance. They are undisciplined. They don't follow the framework. They threaten the order and authority of those sitting in palaces. For the Vatican, a miracle without a license is more terrifying than a scandal. And do you know how the Holy See, the representatives of supreme power, responded? Unverified. Do not publish. That's it. They stamped it shut like a lazy postal worker. Rome does not like noisy corpses, but they also didn't dare discard the report. That vibration of the church floor, that ghostly chanting, it is still locked away in this archive. There is more. Early 20th century, in an African village. No dead people speaking, but the sky went mad. A missionary trembling as he sketched what he and the entire village saw. Brilliant glowing spheres, hovering, arranged in a perfect circle above the chapel. They pulsed rhythmically, like haunted lanterns in the air. He didn't dare use the word miracle. He only dared write, "Something as yet inexplicable." The tone of the Vatican when handling these documents is what makes me shiver the most. It is terrifyingly dry. They strip away all the wonder, terror, tears, and blood of the witnesses, and then repackage them into data points, dates, coordinates, meteorology. That is not science. That is the administrative machine confronting the greatness of the universe, and that machine chooses to stuff the universe into a file clip. But we must ask ourselves, why not burn them? Why would an organization based on dogma, always preaching absolute truth, keep a library of the absurd? Because, my friends, this drawer is not a treasure trove of certainty. It is a treasure trove of doubt. Here, the Vatican silently confesses the heart of religion contains not only light, but also nameless black holes. The language of discomfort. That is what I find everywhere in this drawer. A 17th century village where children heard wild music drifting over the fields in the middle of the night, and the ground seemed to hum. The bishop personally verified and fearfully confirmed it. The Vatican's response: unresolved, do not proclaim. A 19th century Asian priest dreamed of his church being burned down, and a few weeks later, lightning struck and collapsed the roof. Rome's word: prophetic, not a miracle. Archive only. They do not deny that these events are true. They discard them because they do not fit. The Vatican is the protector of order. Better to let wonder sleep than to risk chaos. However, when you stand here, touching these layers of coarse paper, you do not see a lie. You see humility wrapped in the shell of fear. These testimonies were written out of pure horror and preserved with a strange reverence. Even the most powerful organization on earth, the one that always claims to hold the keys to heaven, sometimes must choose silence before a world that is far too bizarre. I close the extraordinaria drawer, a box filled with the whispers of God, or of something else. Wonder, even when locked in the dark, always finds a way to breathe. But believe me, the things in this drawer are still nothing compared to what they use to end human thought. If the previous room was where the Vatican hid God's jokes, then welcome to where they hide human jokes. We are standing before the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books. Do you see these neat lines? Title, author, date of banning. It looks like the library system at your university, but don't be mistaken. These are not library cards. These are sentences. For over 4 centuries, from the bloody and fiery era of the Reformation until 1966, this index was the Holy See's greatest sword of censorship. They said it was used to protect the faithful from corruption and heresy. But in reading these files, I realize a naked truth. This index does not manage faith. It manages fear. The fear of ideas that are too free, too sharp, and capable of shattering the order they painstakingly built. Every condemned book had a reason. Sometimes it was a dogmatic conflict. Sometimes it was for supporting democracy. And sometimes the reason was so pathetic it was funny, too provocative, too ill-timed. But here's the most ironic part, the greatest paradox of this room. They did not burn them. The Vatican cast these books out of the sunlight, forbade the flock from reading them, but in the darkness, they bound, cataloged, and cherished them. This place is not a graveyard of thought. It is a prison holding voices that are still screaming. Listen to the story of a Jesuit monk in the early 1700s. Not the era of rockets or satellites, mind you. At that time, he wrote a manuscript about intelligent life beyond Earth, extraterrestrial theology. He posed a question that made Rome break into a sweat. If God is infinite, why could his creation not be infinite? Would aliens have original sin? Would Jesus have to fly to other planets to be crucified? The book was banned immediately for carrying a disturbing cosmology. But do you know what lies next to that sentence? The monk's letter of defense. He wrote, "Is asking such a thing heresy or is contemplating it an act of worship? The plea fell into the void. He was exiled elsewhere, but his letter remains here, breathing this dusty air for over 300 years. And it wasn't just aliens. In the 18th and 19th centuries, essays on democracy, on civil rights, on the limits of a king's power, banned to the Vatican at that time. Freedom was a poison that weakened their power. And now, those are the values we take for granted. How ironic that the archive, which once sought to strangle freedom, accidentally became its most careful guardian. Sometimes people were forced into silence not for denying God, but for demanding too much of him. A 19th century nun dared to write that. The yes fiat of the Virgin Mary when accepting the pregnancy of Jesus was not the submissive obedience of a servant, but a display of active leadership. A woman demanding active power in a male-dominated church. The censors nearly jumped out of their skins. The book was banned instantly, but her handwritten manuscript still lies here. The margins are dense with passionate ink notes from a woman who loved God too much to obediently shut her mouth. When you stroke the spines of these books, scarred by prohibition, you feel the tension between order and imagination, between authority and wonder. The Holy See drew the line. Which questions are allowed to be asked? Which imaginations are allowed to sprout? They wanted to decide not only what was right, but what was safe. But what about the truth? Truth has never trembled before questions. It only makes those in power tremble. In 1966, the index was officially abolished, but its ghost is still imprinted on these shelves. One hand condemns, one hand preserves. The Vatican does not discard these books because deep down they know those forbidden words have an invisible power. They know that even if you stuff a great thought into a drawer and lock it with iron and steel, it will still lie there waiting for a generation brave enough to unlock it, wise enough to grapple with them, and honest enough to listen to the silent screams. Diplomacy. When you hear this word in the context of the Vatican, what do you think of? Treaties dividing the world? Popes making European emperors kneel in the snow to beg for forgiveness? Yes, those boring things are all here, stretching across thousands of miles of shelves. But in this sea of documents honoring the arrogant statecraft of the West, I stumbled upon something out of place. A small, narrow drawer that it seems no one has bothered to touch in a few centuries. On the outside, a single word is pasted. Japan. Let's go back in time to the 17th century. Japan slammed its doors shut to the world. Christianity was outlawed. Missionaries expelled or executed in ways I advise you not to look up before dinner. The remaining believers were pushed underground. They became kakure kirishitan, hidden Christians. They had to disguise statues of the Virgin Mary as the goddess of mercy, canon, whispering Rome's prayers in a secret language in the dark. The Tokugawa shogunate wanted to sever every string connecting this island to the Vatican. Yet, by a miracle of recklessness, or the art of espionage, correspondence still passed back and forth. Look at this letter, dated 1611. It isn't written in Japanese, but in formal Portuguese, the language of trade and diplomacy at the time. It comes from an envoy of Tokugawa. And here is what stunned me. It does not contain a single insult or curse. It is cold, polite, and absolutely lethal. The letter writes, "Your religion divides families and sows discord. Therefore, it cannot be tolerated." Zorro smiles sharply, tapping a finger on the paper. Do you see the ruthless pragmatism here? The shogunate did not deny the Pope's power. They simply said, "Your power has no place in our country." A respectful refusal, but sharp as a katana. How did the Vatican respond to this diplomatic slap? They faltered. Yes, the Vatican, the power that could make European kings lose sleep, chose silence. They wrote a beautiful draft about peace, then threw it in a drawer, too risky to provoke the shogunate. But if the officials in Rome chose silence, the martyrs on the front lines did not think so. The real game of espionage lies here. Secret letters smuggled through Portuguese merchants, cleverly hidden inside the hollow bases of wooden statues. They are cries for help from hell. Missionaries reported on a church operating like ghosts. We exist like ghosts, but ghosts can also carry light. That is what they wrote. They baptized in secret. They held onto scraps of faith behind closed doors, while the shogunate's sword was always at their throats. And what did Rome do? Send an army? No. They sent back codes, blessings encoded into harmless characters. Rome only dared to whisper in the dark while their flock was bleeding in the light. In this entire massive archive, this is perhaps what haunts me most. A message from the community of hidden Christians, passed through countless risky intermediaries. We hold on to our faith though we cannot speak it. We baptize though we cannot profess. Tell the Holy Father in Rome that though his children are hunted, they still remember his name. The response to this letter never existed, or it went missing. It was never read grandiosely in St. Peter's Square. The Pope likely read it in a dark room, sighed, and then put it away. Look at this strange dance. The Tokugawa shogunate refused with firm, pragmatic resolve. The Vatican hesitated, hoped, and was calculatedly cowardly. Neither side yielded. Neither side truly won. Yet through centuries, the words of the hunter and the prey lie next to each other, peaceful in the same drawer in Rome, sandwiched between pages like pressed dry flowers, fragile, drained of lifeblood, but not at all crumbled. There are history lessons not written in blood on the battlefield or in ink on treaties. They are written in letters that never reached their destination. The Vatican keeps this drawer not as a trophy, nor as an insult. They keep it because they know a heartbreaking truth, that sometimes the greatest glory of faith is not conquering an empire, but the silent endurance under the sword of that empire. Rome's most sacred act in this chess game was not granting a miracle. It was keeping this drawer to remember that even when forced into absolute silence, humans will still find a way to speak. We have reached the absolute end of this level of hell. Just 2 words, but they were enough to make all of medieval Europe piss their pants. Processus Inquisitionis, the Inquisition files. You've seen the movies, haven't you? You think the Inquisition was a crowd of men in red robes, eyes bulging, fanatics waving torches and screaming in the name of God? Zorro strokes the wooden spine of a drawer, smirking. Dead wrong. The most terrifying thing about the Inquisition wasn't fanaticism, it was hesitation. They weren't bloodthirsty monsters, they were intellectuals trapped in ultimate fear. The year is 1600. Giordano Bruno is burned alive for daring to declare that the universe is infinite and that there are other worlds besides Earth. Well, sounds like 6th grade physics today, doesn't it? But back then, it was a death sentence. The interrogation transcript lies right here in my hand, heavy with ink and despair. Bruno roared, "I do not recant, for I cannot recant what I believe to be the truth." The judges pressured him, gave him a chance to save himself. Why? Because they craved his death? No! Look at this note from one of the judges. If we spare him, the doctrine will shake. If we burn him, history will not forgive. There it is. That is the true cruelty. They knew the heat of the fire. They knew they would become villains in the eyes of posterity. But they still chose the flame, because for the Vatican, scrubbing bloodstains from their hands was easier than patching a crack in the wall of their power. Don't think they only hunted great philosophers. A Spanish boy was arrested for reading banned books, arguing naively. I read to understand, not to deny. A group of peasants in northern Italy were tortured into becoming witches just because they dared use herbs and pray for rain for their crops. Communities were torn apart. Neighbors denounced neighbors to survive. And do you know what is most haunting in these transcripts? The verdict for those acquitted after years of imprisonment. He is innocent, but his faith has been shattered. The Inquisition didn't protect faith. It was a soul-crushing machine, lubricated by fear. But the Vatican did not burn these files. They kept it all, as a way of admitting their faith was once built upon the ashes of human beings. But what is the price of ultimate power? If the Inquisition was how the Church punished the world, then this last drawer is how the world punished the Church. Correspondentia privata, the private correspondence of the popes. No bulls, no dogmas, no heroic sermons before millions of the flock. This is where the most powerful men in the world removed their heavy crowns, knelt in the darkness, and wailed. Pope Gregory XV, 17th century. In the midst of religious wars tearing Europe apart, he wrote a letter to an anonymous brother. His hand trembled. If I speak too boldly, I divide the faithful. If I remain silent, I betray them. The letter was never sent. Pope Pius IX, 19th century, upon losing the Papal States, he wrote on a scrap of paper, "I am the shepherd of millions. Yet the truth is, I wander as if exiled from my own pasture." The king of the spiritual world confessed his ultimate helplessness. And this, the diary of Pope Pius XII during World War II. As trains carrying Jews rolled toward concentration camps, he remained silent in public, fearing that if he spoke, Hitler would massacre even more ruthlessly. But in the darkness of this archive, he wrote, "I carry the prayers of millions, but I also carry the weight of unspeakable sorrows." I used to wonder, why did the Vatican keep these documents? Why did they archive the weakness, the turmoil, and the sleepless nights of the saviors? During World War I, Pope Benedict XV wrote a single line in Latin, "The world is tearing itself apart, and I, who should heal, cannot mend even a single wound." There was even a pope who left a line that tore through all dogma. "I kneel, but there are nights when I do not feel heaven is listening. Perhaps faith is praying, even when the sky is silent." That is the reason the Vatican Archive exists. It is not a museum of power. It is a massive mausoleum containing our most fragile humanity. They keep the inexplicable miracles because they know the world is larger than their brains. They keep the banned books because they know the truth will never die. They keep the Inquisition files because they do not permit themselves to forget the crimes created by their own fear. And they keep the tears of the Pope to remind them even the rock sometimes trembles. Even the representative of God sometimes wonders if God is listening. We are always looking for dark forces or crazy conspiracy theories behind closed doors. But the most terrifying and brutal truth hidden at the Vatican is that they were completely, absolutely, and painfully only human. Look at this first file. The signature on it would make any art historian shiver. Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Yes, the rock star of the Baroque period, the man who turned marble into breathing flesh and dancing angels. Bernini's works are scattered all over Rome, completely blurring the line between art and adoration. But here, on this brittle paper, is a design for the altar of St. Peter's Basilica that history was robbed of. Look, it's as if heaven itself were on fire. Breathtaking, isn't it? But our venerable cardinals didn't think so. I can read their panic through the attached letters. Some admired it, calling it a theater of glory. But the majority recoiled in horror. They called it a distraction. That the faithful would only gape at this theater of stone and forget to, forget to repent. The faithful will see theater before they see divinity, one cardinal wrote with a trembling, uneasy stroke. You see, they feared beauty. They feared an altar that stirred more drama than blind submission. And so, the design was shoved into a locked drawer. St. Peter's remains magnificent, but it forever lost this explosion of light and movement. Bernini was stifled by the apprehension of those in red robes. But Bernini wasn't the only victim. Fast forward to the Counter-Reformation. An anonymous artist sketched a fresco that could make even Satan break into a sweat. Angels descending in red fire, demons shrieking in the shadows, saints standing cold as stone pillars amidst a collapsing empire. A violent vision, born to strike absolute terror into the minds of the heathens. But the censorship board recoiled. This image stirs more fear than devotion, they argued. Others argued that fear was needed to slap cold souls awake. Arguing, debating, and the end result? The wall was left blank. No fire. If you go to Rome today and pass that empty wall, you will never know that once you were meant to kneel in terror before what was drawn there. And this is what haunts me the most. A drawing of the Savior. Not a king in glorious victory. No reigning. No halo. Just a man collapsing under the weight of a massive timber. His body bent, his head slumped to the ground, his divinity completely swallowed by the darkness of exhaustion. Do you know what the supreme evaluators of the Vatican said? Too human. That's what they wrote. The faithful must see divinity, not weakness. How ridiculous. Looking at this sketch, I don't see a weak God. I see ultimate solidarity, a God willing to suffer with us, to collapse when we collapse. But, oh boy, that naked truth was too painful a slap to the face of a church wanting to flaunt its power. They didn't need a tired Christ. They needed a grand Christ to justify their own grandeur. And so, the statue was never carved. The 19th century, an artist drew the church as a tattered ship in a storm, the mast broken, the apostles clinging fearfully to the ropes. The message was too clear. The church exists by luck and grace, not because it is invincible. The Vatican's response? Too destabilizing. Do not let the faithful see the church as weak. The painting was shelved. A laughably sad irony. By trying to hide their vulnerability, they exposed their own fragile mask. Next, a drawing of the Virgin Mary. No crown, no brilliant halo. Just a young mother slumped on a stool, holding her child with exhausted arms, eyes heavy from lack of sleep. The rejection verdict was only 2 words. Too mundane. Too mundane? The greatest greatness of motherhood, the holiness found right in the exhausted, sleepless nights of a mother, was considered mundane. The church chose a fake majesty of gold and icons and locked the humanity of a woman into this dark corner just because it was too bold to be displayed. Do you see the pattern here? These masterpieces weren't rejected because the artists lacked talent. They were silenced because they dared to speak truths the church wasn't ready to face. That Christ also had moments of exhaustion. That Mary was as tired as any other mother. That the church itself is just a tattered ship before the storm. Art is theology molded into form. And these forms dared to ask, can majesty be found in exhaustion? Can faith tremble and still be faith? The Vatican did not burn these drawings. That is the strangest thing. They kept them, categorized them, cherished them carefully as if they themselves knew that these truths were too large to throw into the fire, but too dangerous to expose to the sunlight. Walking in this room, I don't see the failures of art. I see the failures of courage. Fear locked away the truest, most human beauties to leave room for a safe but hollow glory. The room breathes the air of absence, where the silence of brittle paper screams louder than any giant marble statue out there. Perhaps the greatest masterpieces are always the ones imprisoned, gritting their teeth, waiting for a final era brave enough to look them in the eye. If you take a stroll through most of the corridors in the Vatican archives, you will feel an invisible pressure. The weight of time. It is constant, thick and flowing like a river that never runs dry. You can step over centuries like stepping over boulders. Papal blood decrees, councils that shook Europe, diplomatic letters reeking of intrigue, fierce theological debates. One era blends into the next, weaving a massive tapestry of both ultimate faith and extreme fear. But if you are observant enough like me, you will notice a tear, a chillingly nonsensical rupture in that tapestry of history, a silence that doesn't stem from lost documents or moldy rot. No, this silence comes from a deliberate arrangement. It is the stillness of the modern world. The deeper I dig into this pile of records, the more I realize something bizarre. Do you know what is absent here? Electricity, railways, airplanes, cinema, radio, computers, and yes, the internet. The entire catalog of inventions that steered human history in the 19th and 20th centuries simply evaporated from the pages. It's as if the Vatican dropped an iron curtain right at the boundary of modernity, stood by with arms crossed, and firmly said, "No, we will not allow this mundane trash to enter the realm of sacred memory." Don't misunderstand, my friend. The church was never blind. They aren't senile old men living in a cave. The popes knew full well how the world was spinning. They once rattled off speeches about workers' rights during the Industrial Revolution. They once cleared their throats to warn about the moral decay of cinema. But when you search the official archives, boom, everything turns into smooth, harmless euphemisms. Take Vatican Council I as an example. Late 19th century. Europe at the time was choking on the soot of the Industrial Revolution. Trains tore across continents. Factories sprouted like poisonous mushrooms. Cities swelled with elites and hurried workers. The world was going mad for machines. Yet, in the archive records of this council, you can't find the words industry or machines if you tried. Instead, do you know what they recorded? Pastoral challenges, the duty of vigilance against worldly distraction. Good God. Where the whole world saw the dawn of a great era, the protectors of the archive reduced it to a cheap temptation of the devil. There is an even more eerie silence. Electricity. For centuries, the great cathedrals were lit by the flickering flames of candles and oil lamps, a light that danced, flickered, and created giant shadows filled with mystery. Then electricity appeared. The incandescent bulb dealt a crushing blow to that ancient holiness, brightly illuminating churches even when the sun was dead. Do you think they would record this heated debate? That there would be priests screaming that electric light is harsh and mundane, while others praised it as a miracle of progressive God? No, absolutely not. The church maintenance ledger stops abruptly right before the day the first electrical device was installed, as if plugging a wire into a socket was a shame not worth recording in history. Darkness was defeated, but the memory of that battle was wiped clean without a trace. And it doesn't stop there. In the early 20th century, cinema was born. Movies began brainwashing the world, shaping culture. But in the archive, cinema does not exist as an art form. It only appears as a rap on the head with a ruler. Moving images may corrupt the youth. Maintain humility. No analysis. No naming. Radio? It shaped the entirety of World War II, but they only called it a new means of proclamation. By the time of the internet, the erasure was absolute. The digital world doesn't even have the privilege of stepping a toe into this room. Instead, the ledgers are stuffed with self-deluded incantations. God's truth is not bound by novelties. What is fleeting cannot weigh upon the memory of the Church. Do you see the ridiculous contradiction? The archive is not a place to record what happened. It is a brainwashing machine designed to reinforce what the Church wants the world to believe. They want to wear the cloak of eternity. And if they meticulously recorded trains, light bulbs, or the internet, it would be like slapping their own faces, admitting the Church is also molded and shaped by this mundane world. Better to stay silent, to let modern history pass without being allowed to leave even a greasy fingerprint on the sacred parchment scrolls. But in the margin of a discarded file, I found a pen and ink note from an anonymous archivist from the mid-20th century. It read, "We preserve eternity by excluding the present." That sentence gave me chills. It exposed the whole magic trick. The absence is not accidental. It is a frantic act of self-defense. They fear transience. The Vatican's greatest fear is not scandals or heretics. Their greatest fear is non-eternity. However, silence is never a void. It lingers, like a ghost. When future historians open these drawers, they won't see a church standing above the flow of time. They will see a church with its eyes shut tight, hands covering its ears, and its back turned to reality. The void becomes the most powerful confession. Even eternity, when staged and trimmed, reeks of fear. Deliberate stillness in the end is the most piercing scream. When you close your eyes and imagine the Vatican, what do you see? Magnificent gold-plated halls? Powerful cardinals stretching out in robes of crimson silk? Popes gliding with the majesty of God's representative? Of course, that's the perfect picture they want you to see. A kingdom of powerful, withered men. But deep in a damp corner of the archive, I pulled out a thin file. Not gilded, not velvet bound. It was tied with a rotted ribbon labeled Pueri Palati Apostolici, the boys of the Apostolic Palace. Welcome to the flip side of splendor, where childhood was stolen, wrapped in oversized uniforms, and offered as a sacrifice on the altar of ritual. These aren't decrees that change the world. These are echoes of tiny souls, pages, altar boys, young servants growing up right under the shadow of St. Peter's dome. The noble families of Europe at the time gave their sons to the church, considering it the ultimate honor, a perfect political ladder. But did they ever ask these children what they wanted? Of course not. Hear the story of Matteo, a 7-year-old boy who stepped into the palace in the early 17th century. The first letter he sent home was soaked in awe. He spoke of ceilings as high as heaven, of the heavy scent of incense, of the ultimate pride of having a cardinal pat his head. Everything glittered like a fairy tale. But then, time passed. The tone in the subsequent letters changed. No more wonder, only bone-chilling loneliness. He craved the bright laughter of his sister, the warmth of the hearth at home. Matteo wrote this sentence, "Here, even when hundreds of people are walking about, it is as still as if these stone walls were opening their mouths to swallow every word." Can you imagine it? A place stifled by splendor is also a place stifled by silence. Children who by nature should be running, screaming, and covered in mud, were trained to move like weightless ghosts. Laughter was measured. Joy was strangled. And here is the most disgusting part. A disciplinary report recorded the punishment of a page. The reason? Stealing, vandalism? No. The boy was punished for holding the hand of an old servant writhing in fever, refusing to leave as the man was dying. The supervisor's comment was cold as a blade. Too much softness. The child must learn to be stern if he wishes to serve. Brilliant. Truly brilliant. Humans' most primal compassion was put on trial as a sin. In that world of men in red robes, children had to learn to become stone statues. The church believed that strict discipline would forge holiness. But through these pages, I only see that fake holiness chewing up the tenderness of humanity. But fortunately, you cannot completely kill a child. Resistance flared up in hidden corners. Some secretly read Dante by flickering candlelight until their eyes grew dim, only to be scolded for seeking beauty in the place, told to seek stillness. Other children sang secretly in the chapel when no one was around, borrowing music as a cloak against the cold of discipline. They drew birds in the margins of dry Latin exercises. They folded paper boats and hid them in the crevices of church pews. Tiny rebellions, silent screams reaching for the freedom of souls, refusing to be extinguished. One unsigned letter. It haunts me even now. Listen, they say we are chosen to serve, but I think we are chosen to be silent. I pray God hears children because here no one else does. In a massive palace built for the sole purpose of proclaiming the word of God, the smallest, purest voices felt completely abandoned. Their childhood was sacrificed in exchange for glamorous rituals. Families received prestige, but it was the children who paid the price with their entire lives. The archive didn't bother recording where the children went after serving. Some became priests, cardinals, most vanished into anonymous darkness. To the Vatican, their value only existed as long as they gritted their teeth and served in silence. But the fact they preserved these crooked scribbles accidentally became an indictment. Closing the file, I feel as if I still hear the sound of heels scuffing on marble. I wonder a question these texts never dared to write. What is the price of holiness, if it requires us to strangle compassion? History will never cast statues of these boys, but in this dusty basement, their crushed innocence is still screaming, a scream that tears through every lie about sanctity. We have seen the church censor beauty, deny progress, and chew up childhood. But what about those at the bottom? The devout sheep they constantly claim to protect? This drawer isn't gold-plated. Its label is written in cheap ink, faded into a blood rust brown. Chronica Villarum, Village Chronicles. If you were expecting dry tax reports or baptismal ledgers, sorry, you're wrong. Lying in here are screams. The screams of the lowly peasants, of priests poor as dirt, people with a faith as hard and cracked as the barren land they tilled. These documents were written on coarse paper, the ink smudged. Not by mold, my friend, but smudged by rain, sweat, and perhaps by tears. France, 14th century. A priest wrote directly to Rome like this. The people are starving, and they ask where God has gone. He described the scene of villagers scraping up weeds to boil, of children wasting away, skin and bones right before his eyes. They paraded relics. They rang bells until their hands tore to drive away despair. But the sky remained silent. He concluded with a sentence that slashed the throat of Rome's theology. The faithful kneel, but the earth gives no bread. How do you think Rome answered? There was no answer. The archive simply swallowed this letter into the void. A village in England during the Great Plague. Death was thick in the air. The priest there recorded a reality so brutal it could tear up any moral sermon. A mother refuses to nurse her child. A brother refuses to bury his sister. Charity has become thin when the graves are already full. That is when faith is stripped bare, my friends. There are no magnificent councils discussing the nature of heaven there. There is only the harshest instinct for survival. Rural priests understood this better than any fat cardinal at the Vatican. One priest wrote a sentence that I consider to be the greatest theological statement ever recorded. If I tell them God is silent, they will despair. If I tell them God is near, I am lying. So I tell them both, and I kneel beside them in the cold. The faith of these people was not a solid marble fortress. It was a tattered, patched-up tent, erected right in the eye of the storm. But amidst that black hole of despair, wonder appeared, not from the sky, but from humans themselves. A father in Spain carved a crude wooden cross for his young daughter who just died of fever. He planted it in the ground and prayed, "If heaven takes her, let heaven see that she had a father who loved her." In Poland, peasants planted flowers on the graves of their loved ones, not for beauty, but as an ultimate challenge. If death surrounds us, let beauty bloom louder. History has a habit of trampling and forgetting the poor, but strangely, the powers that be at the Vatican kept these records. It's as if they knew their church doesn't stand firm because of hollow doctrines, but stands firm because of the cracked hands and the pathetically fragile hopes of these people. And here's the final point of the journey. The ultimate vault, where there are no decrees, no sentences, where fragments are kept, half-written letters, confessions on the back of a receipt, a sheet of music with notes crossed out repeatedly because they were too sad. Listen to this. "Forgive us for what we did not say." Another scrap, only half a sentence. "I believe, but..." The rest is a permanent void. There is even a child's crude drawing of a dove on the edge of a formal document. In this anonymous vault, I suddenly realized the greatest secret of the Vatican. We always assumed this archive was a place to hide dark conspiracies, to protect power. But no, it is grander and more terrifying than that. It preserves fragility. The archivists do not preserve to convict. They preserve to certify. They know that history is built not only from victories and authority, but from the ruptures, the hesitations, and the most miserable failures of humanity. They hide them not because they are ashamed. They hide them because the truth is sometimes too heavy to scream in the squares, too fragile to be exposed in the bright sunlight. They age memory like a cellar of poisonous wine, gritting their teeth, waiting for a future generation strong enough to drink it dry without going mad. The secret archive of the Vatican is not a dark warehouse. It is a cathedral of stillness, where history itself is kneeling, where secrets are not deceit, but the most ruthless form of love, the only way to hold on to unbearable pain without making this world shatter.